But yeah, now I want to got this article on a local dependent news site. It's actually written by, uh-oh. Oh, here we go. Written by a friend of mine, a Facebook friend of mine, whom I've actually never met in person. We're friends on Facebook. And apparently I did not see it when it was first published. So or maybe I did and didn't link it on my Facebook, or I don't know. Anyways, it's a really good article. This was written during middle of the pandemic. So it says, throughout this pandemic, we have seen a number of long-standing notions about our society turned on their heads. Truism that the bosses create value rather than workers went by the wayside among numerous wildcat strikes. The argument against Medicare for all on financial grounds dissipated after trillions of dollars were pumped into the stock market and into banks and corporations at a moment's notice. Why, even the tried and true battle-tested idea that ingesting bleach and rubbing alcohol can cure disease went the way of the dodo just last week. But now's the time to take down the central, most destructive and ridiculous societal norm we have. I don't know if that's the most destructive and ridiculous, but it's one of them. The fiction of private property. Before we continue, let me just state that nobody's going after your toothbrush, your iPhone, or even your car. When we speak about property, we're speaking about land and accumulated capital. To illustrate how ridiculous an idea of private property is, let us consider a few examples. Property is a byproduct of law and the philosophies that uphold it. In this country, the founding fathers were scholars of and adherents to Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Hobbes. These philosophers were wealthy landowners who were certainly not going to philosophize their way out of their material material wealth and class privilege, no matter where the logic led. Locke and Hobbes railed against the divine rights of king and aristocrat, posited the rights of man as life, liberty, and property. However, as former lower aristocracy, they conveniently forgot that their own property holdings would permit them to accumulate more, while the new working class, essentially propertyless, would have a much harder time. And speaking about rights, if one group gets more than another, then it ceases to be a right. Speaking about the natural rights of man, these men were thinking exclusively of a well-heeled middle-class man, not women, men. As we know, there was a considerable lapse between the penning of these natural rights and the inclusion of women, African slaves, Italians, Poles, Irish, and Jews joining them, among others. Certain American Indian and Australian Aboriginal groups had no concept of private property, which certainly does away with its status as a universal right. So at best we can say that these Enlightenment ideas on property are born of a biased perspective. Wait a second. The very idea of law and property is racist and biased? Wait, hold on. Yup. The founding fathers themselves, wealthy landowners, landholders, and slave owners, calcified the property myth when drawing up the nation's laws. This included human beings as property, an electoral college meant to subvert the will of the electorate, and the helpful suggestion that white male property owners be the only class allowed to vote, allowing property, the supposed right of all, to stay in the hands of a privileged few. Now we can see just how shaky this notion of property really is, but we can go even deeper. In all jurisdictions of the United States, before one dies, it is wise to consult an attorney to determine what is to be done with one's property after death. This document was the last testament, must be written by a lawyer, duly called to the bar, signed, witnessed, notarized, and then scrutinized by a probate court, usually a panel of lawyers experts in estate law. Jurisdictions have differing rules in a state law, meaning that what can be done in one jurisdiction cannot necessarily be done in another. So much for consistency in private property. A relatively weak point, I think. I don't know whether the author necessarily needs to include that, but it does strengthen their argument, so why not, right? However, if the lawyer makes a mistake in writing a will, or if for some reason it cannot pass muster with the probate court, in some cases the state is permitted to take a speculative interest in the decedent's property. This is the same state established by property owners and buttressed by law and philosophy that property owners conceived of to enshrine their dubious right to property. The state also claims to promote the public welfare, but in some cases where a will is considered invalid, intestacy in legal parlance, the state appropriates the decedent's property and sells it to the highest bidder. The public welfare might dictate that a dead man's house becomes a school, a medical clinic, or collective housing, but it generally ends in the hands of the property class, which, along with eminent domain, continues the cyclical, farcical notion of private property. Exclusive ownership of land is so absurd that it merits little in the way of serious discussion. Absolutely 100% true. If one is going to lay exclusive claim to ownership of land through deed, contract, or commingling of labor as the law dictates, one may just as logically claim ownership of, say, a star, several cubic yards of the Earth's atmosphere, the depths of the ocean, landmass on one of the moons of Jupiter, or several light years in interstellar space. Absolutely. We have established that property as a right does not cover everybody, undermining its status as a right. We have further established that its place of prominence in both philosophy and jurisprudence is due to the fact that property owners wrote these laws and philosophical texts. We know that the state can abrogate the right to property on an inconsistent basis, and that claiming exclusive ownership of land is on its face ridiculous. But we can move away from land as property and enter into capital as property. In a capitalist society such as ours, workers are required to sell their labor power in exchange for a wage. The worker does a job, the boss pays the worker comes back, and the cycle continues. But what is the motivation for the boss to continue the enterprise, and where does it come from? The motivation is, of course, profit, what neoclassical economists euphemistically call the surplus of labor, or what remains after the product is sold and the wages and overhead paid. However, if we consult Karl Marx, he will talk about the exploitation labor, namely that there is no such thing as a surplus of labor, given that the workers produce the whole of the value. What the boss retains as profit rightfully belongs to the worker who produced the value, and no matter how well paid one is, one will never be paid at a level commensurate with the value produced. This is the Marxian theory of exploitation of labor in a nutshell, and from this we can take one step further in deconstructing property. Profits of business, hoarded in bank accounts, are in fact wages stolen from workers that the owner keeps. Since accumulated capital allows for the acquisition of more property, we can think of it as a form of property, or at least a substitute. Absolutely. As long as money can buy property, then yeah. And if the accumulation of capital depends on undercutting the worker who produced the value, we can repair to the famous words of French mutualist Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who exclaimed property is theft. Well said. Private property, they should say. Public property is a different thing. Public property is owned by everyone. So, property is a universal right, but somehow not everybody has it. Framers shilly-shallied when wow, that's a word. Is that a word? Okay. When composing the Declaration of Independence, claiming one had the right to the pursuit of happiness, but they were well aware that property holders stood to acquire more property than those forced to sell their labor. Property is a central part of our societal framework, yet law treats it inconsistently. Property is an unalienable right, yet the state can speculate on your private property after you die if your lawyer did sloppy work. Well, heck, the state can. Public property has issues too, of course. But ideally, when you're talking about public property, everybody has equal ownership of that property. In a representative democracy, however, we would need our representatives to make decisions about how that property is to be used. But if any decisions on that property limit access to anybody else, then that is a violation of their human rights. Property is a central part of our societal framework, yet law treats it inconsistently. Property is an unalienable right. The state can speculate on property after you die. We already read this. If your lawyer did sloppy work writing a will and pass it on to another property holder at pure profit, a business's profit represents in actuality a systematic theft from those who create the value, which leads to the further consolidation of property among a smaller and smaller property class. And conservatives, of course, would be like, oh well, the workers will never be able to do the laboring and make the product without the capital. Without the capital, we need capital. We need capitalists. We need private property. No, if everything is publicly owned, then there's no issue. All we have to do is figure out how to use it. A business's profit represents in actuality a systematic theft from those who create the value, which leads to the further consolidation of property among a smaller and smaller property class. And this is capitalism. This is what's happening in the world, and this is what's been happening in the world. As long as we have allowed, private enterprise to infringe on human rights, as long as we don't make laws that protect people's human rights over that of, private enterprise and private property, then this is what happens. So the myth of private property that the ruling class established and lawyers dependent upon the ruling class were reified, I don't know if that's a word either, represents the greatest scam humankind has committed against itself. One of them, banking is, I guess banking comes from this whole idea. Banking is sort of an offshoot of this idea, but yeah, banking is a big scam too. But yeah, this came before the banking. Banking is sort of an effect of this system of private ownership of property, the colonial system. The greatest scam humankind has committed against itself. An embarrassing failure of imagination and is a prehistoric notion that retards our evolution as a species. Absolutely agree with that. What can be done to undermine this dangerous fiction? Not a big fan of that word, though. Although it is valid when used in the right context, which it is here. I just don't like it. Can you choose something different? What can be done to undermine this dangerous fiction? We can begin by guaranteeing housing as a human right and establishing public ownership of housing. Competition for fewer and fewer dwelling units allows owners to charge whatever they please, regardless of ability to pay. If housing is guaranteed and the public maintains it, we can nibble away at this oppressive fantasy. I don't know if it's a fantasy, though, is it? It's a reality. Well, yeah, we can change it. Secondly, we can harshly punish real estate speculation, as the English common law did. Speculators in England were routinely put to death as their speculation did not add to the productive economy. That sounds a little extreme, but I guess, yeah. Point taken. We can see similar patterns today with hedge funds, private equity firms, and real estate speculators gentrifying places like Missoula, Bozeman, and Whitefish, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Denver, and San Francisco. Finally, we can place maximums on profits companies earn while simultaneously placing ownership and decision making in the hands of workers and trade unions. This would discourage the hoarding of capital, thus destabilizing the property that depends on accumulated capital increase and increasing company revenue. Um, and another anti-capitalist measure that I think is really important is just antitrust law and you know, uh, that sort of thing where because that's the nature of capitalism, is that smaller companies get bought out by bigger companies and become consolidated, and control of that sector of the economy falls into fewer and fewer hands, which can then collude with each other to raise prices and not have to compete. So antitrust law, I think, is a big part of, and we've had nerfs to our antitrust laws. We need stronger antitrust laws, and yeah. So I think that's another important part of it too. So discourage the hoarding of capital, thus destabilizing the property that depends on accumulated capital, increasing company revenue. Many previously unquestioned ideas have fallen apart amid the coronavirus epidemic. Now we have the chance to take apart the most destructive one of all, the concept of private property. If we begin to guarantee housing, shift ownership to those who create the value rather than those who appropriate it, and punish speculation and profiteering, this is big thing too. Um, Windfall profit taxes, capping profits that companies can legally make. They can build a more just society, break the haughty power of the wealthy elite, and extend more peace and security to more and more people. Finally, we can use this opportunity to continue the Enlightenment experiment, which I don't know if I really agree with that sentiment there. I don't know if it was so enlightened. The whole Enlightenment was so enlightened after all, was it? Let's just end it. Start a new experiment. How about that? A new experiment where we extend the rights proffered therein to the entire world, making quantum leap forward of species away from the dark ages of late capitalism and towards greater progress and prosperity. Not a huge fan of that last sentence, but I understand the meaning and agree with it. I think that's a really awesome article. A buddy of mine on Facebook wrote. It appeared in Missoula Current, which is an independent news site here in Missoula, in April 2020, over 2 years ago. But I figured today was a good day to go through that, because I don't know if I'd have ever read this article. I don't know if I ever saw it in the first place till just recently when I was researching this whole idea of private property being um, private property being theft, or the idea that private property, at least it should be regulated a lot a lot more, uh, a lot more than it is being regulated, and especially for the purposes of housing. Public property, public housing needs to happen in this country. Otherwise, it's just the problems that this country faces are just gonna get worse. But yeah, great article.